The morning sun cast long shadows across Pine Ridge shooting range as Frank Mitchell parked his old Ford pickup in the same spot he'd been using for 3 years. At 62, Frank had settled into a routine that brought him peace after decades of chaos. Every Tuesday and Thursday at 8 sharp, he'd arrive with his worn rifle case and a thermos of black coffee. Frank wasn't much to look at anymore. His gray hair had thinned considerably, and his once muscular frame had softened around the edges. He wore the same faded jeans and flannel shirt most days, looking like any other retiree trying to fill his time. The other shooters at Pine Ridge knew him as the quiet guy who kept to himself, shot decent groups, and never bragged about his skills. What they didn't know was that Frank Mitchell had once been Staff Sergeant Mitchell, one of the Army's most decorated snipers. His military career had ended 22 years ago, and he'd spent the time since working construction, raising 2 kids with his late wife Sarah, and trying to forget the weight of the scope that had once been his closest companion. The shooting range was Frank's therapy now, not the kind with couches and questions about feelings, but the honest therapy of breath control, steady hands, and the simple satisfaction of hitting what you aimed at. He'd set up at the 200-yard line, methodically load his hunting rifle, and work through 50 rounds with the same precision he'd once used to protect his fellow soldiers. On this particular Thursday morning, Frank noticed a young man watching him from the next lane over. The kid looked to be in his early 30s, physically fit, with the kind of alert posture that screamed military even in civilian clothes. Frank had seen the type before, active duty guys who came to ranges on their off days, usually shooting fancy tactical rifles with more accessories than a Christmas tree. But this one was different. He wasn't showing off or trying to impress anyone. He was studying Frank's technique with the focused attention of someone who understood what he was seeing. When Frank paused to check his target through binoculars, the young man approached. "Excuse me, sir," the stranger said politely. "I couldn't help but notice your shooting form. Mind if I ask where you learned to shoot like that?" Frank looked up from his rifle, taking in the young man's appearance more carefully. Short haircut, confident stance, respectful tone. Definitely military, probably special operations if he had to guess. Frank had learned to read people quickly during his service years, and old habits died hard. "Just picked it up over the years," Frank replied with a shrug, not technically lying but not offering details either. "Been hunting since I was 12. The young man nodded, but Frank caught something in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or suspicion. That's some impressive consistency for a hobby shooter. Those groups are tighter than most of our guys manage on qualification day. Frank felt a familiar tension creep up his spine. He'd worked hard to leave his past behind, to become just another civilian enjoying retirement. The last thing he wanted was someone digging into his background or asking questions about skills he'd rather forget. "Well, I've had plenty of practice," Frank said, turning back to his rifle. "Time to kill in retirement, you know how it is." But the young man didn't take the hint. Instead, he extended his hand. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Jake Rodriguez, Army Special Operations Command, and you're definitely not just a hobby shooter." Frank hesitated before shaking the offered hand. Rodriguez's grip was firm, professional, and held just a second longer than necessary. The kind of handshake that said, "I know who you are, even if you're not ready to admit it." "Frank Mitchell," he replied simply. "And I'm just a retired construction worker who likes to shoot." Rodriguez smiled, but it wasn't the patronizing smile of someone who didn't believe him. It was the knowing smile of someone who understood the need for anonymity, for blending in, for leaving the past buried. "Of course you are, Mr. Mitchell. We all need our hobbies after we retire." The emphasis on retire wasn't lost on Frank. This wasn't a coincidental meeting. Rodriguez knew exactly who he was talking to, which meant someone had been watching. Someone had been asking questions. Frank's carefully constructed, peaceful existence suddenly felt a lot less secure. "I should get going," Frank said, beginning to pack up his equipment with practiced efficiency. "My wife's expecting me home for lunch." It was a lie. Sarah had been gone for 4 years now, but it was the kind of lie that usually ended conversations. "Of course," Rodriguez said, not moving away. "But before you go, I wonder if you might be interested in a conversation sometime. Nothing official, just two veterans talking about old times. Maybe over coffee?" Frank paused in his packing. The smart thing would be to say no, to stick to his retirement, to keep his head down and his past buried. But something in Rodriguez's tone suggested this wasn't really a request. When the Army wanted to have a conversation with you, they usually got their way one way or another. "I don't really talk about the old days much," Frank said carefully. "Not much point in dwelling on things that are over and done with." "I understand completely," Rodriguez replied. "But sometimes the old days have a way of becoming relevant again. Sometimes the skills we thought we'd left behind turn out to be exactly what's needed." Frank finished packing his rifle case and stood up, meeting Rodriguez's gaze directly for the first time. In those eyes, he saw the same look he'd once seen in mirrors, the look of someone who'd made impossible shots, who'd carried impossible burdens, who'd done impossible things because someone had to do them. "I'm retired, Colonel," Frank said firmly. "Whatever you think you know about me, whatever you think I used to be able to do, that person doesn't exist anymore. I'm just an old man who comes to the range twice a week to punch holes in paper." Rodriguez nodded slowly but pulled out a business card anyway. "I respect that, Mr. Mitchell, I really do. But if you ever change your mind, or if you ever get curious about why a lieutenant colonel from Special Operations Command just happened to show up at your local shooting range, give me a call." Frank took the card without looking at it, shoving it into his jacket pocket. As he walked toward his truck, he could feel Rodriguez's eyes on his back, could feel the weight of unasked questions and unspoken possibilities. For the first time in 3 years, Frank's peaceful routine had been disrupted, and he had a sinking feeling that things were about to get complicated. Frank spent the rest of Thursday trying to pretend the encounter with Rodriguez never happened. He went through his usual routine: grocery shopping, checking on his neighbor's elderly mother, watching the evening news. But Rodriguez's business card felt like it was burning a hole in his jacket pocket. That night, lying in the bed he'd shared with Sarah for 35 years, Frank found himself staring at the ceiling and remembering things he'd worked hard to forget. The card on his nightstand seemed to glow in the darkness, a small white rectangle that threatened to drag him back into a world he'd left behind. He'd been good at forgetting for 22 years. Good at being just Frank Mitchell, construction supervisor, husband, father. He'd coached his daughter's softball team, helped his son with college applications, and never once mentioned that he could put a bullet through a quarter at 500 yards in a crosswind. Sarah had known, of course. Wives always knew, even when you never talked about it. She'd seen him wake up in cold sweats during the first few years after he got out. She'd noticed how he always sat facing the door in restaurants, how he instinctively cataloged exits and sightlines wherever they went. But Sarah had been smart enough never to push, never to ask questions he couldn't answer. Now Sarah was gone, taken by cancer 4 years ago, and their kids lived across the country with families of their own. Frank's carefully constructed civilian life had fewer anchors than it used to, fewer reasons to stay buried in normalcy. Friday morning came gray and drizzling, matching Frank's mood perfectly. He almost skipped his range session, but routine was what kept him stable. Routine was what kept the memories at bay. So he loaded his rifle case into the truck and drove to Pine Ridge, hoping Rodriguez wouldn't be there. The range was nearly empty due to the weather, just Frank and an old-timer named Bill who liked to shoot black powder rifles. Frank set up at his usual spot and tried to lose himself in the familiar rhythm of loading, aiming, and firing. But his groups were off, his breathing irregular. The card in his pocket might as well have been a brick. After an hour of subpar shooting, Frank gave up and headed for the range's small cafe. Bill was there, drinking coffee and complaining about the weather to anyone who would listen. "Morning, Frank," Bill called out. "Rough day at the office? Your shooting looked a little scattered out there." Frank poured himself coffee and sat down, across from Bill. At 78, Bill was one of the few people at the range who'd served in Vietnam, and he had the easy camaraderie of someone who understood that some stories were better left untold. "Just tired," Frank lied. "Didn't sleep well last night." Bill studied him with sharp eyes that had seen too much in their time. You know, Frank, in all the years I've known you, you've never shot scattered. Rain, shine, hot, cold. You're like a machine out there. Something's eating at you. Frank sipped his coffee and considered his options. Bill was good people, the kind of veteran who'd earned his opinions through blood and mud. If anyone would understand the weight Frank was carrying, it would be him. Had a visitor yesterday, Frank said finally. Army, special operations, asking questions. Bill's expression sobered immediately. They recruiting for something? Maybe, probably. Hell, I don't know. Frank pulled Rodriguez's card from his pocket and laid it on the table between them. Colonel Rodriguez says he just wants to talk about old times. Bill picked up the card and examined it like it might explode. Army Special Operations Command. That's serious business, Frank. They don't send lieutenant colonels to chat with retirees unless something big is happening. That's what I'm afraid of, Frank admitted. I'm done with all that. I did my time, paid my dues. I just want to shoot paper targets and tend my garden. What did you do in the Army? Bill asked gently. I know you served, but you never talk specifics. Frank hesitated. Even after all these years, the classification levels and security clearances were hardwired into his brain. But Bill was a brother veteran, and the burden of silence was getting heavier every year. Sniper, Frank said simply. 2 tours in the Gulf, 1 in Somalia. 87 confirmed kills. Bill whistled low. Jesus, Frank, no wonder they want to talk to you. Skills like that don't grow on trees. Skills like that are supposed to stay buried, Frank replied. I'm not that person anymore, haven't been for over 20 years. But you still shoot like him, Bill pointed out. Muscle memory doesn't forget, even when the mind wants to, Frankie stared at the business card, remembering the weight of his service rifle, the feeling of perfect stillness before taking a shot, the terrible responsibility of holding life and death at the end of a scope. Those memories came with others, friends who didn't make it home, missions that went wrong, the faces of enemies who were probably just scared kids doing what they thought was right. I had nightmares for years, Frank said quietly. Took me a decade to sleep through the night consistently. Sarah helped me build a different life, a better life. I'm not going back to that darkness. Bill nodded, understanding. But what if they really need you? What if there's something happening that only someone with your skills can handle? Then they can find someone younger, someone who hasn't spent 20 years learning to forget, Frank shot back, perhaps more harshly than he intended. Maybe, Bill said. But experience matters, Frank. Wisdom matters. A young sniper has fast reflexes and sharp eyes. An old sniper has something more valuable, judgment. Frank thought about Rodriguez's words. Sometimes the old days have a way of becoming relevant again. What kind of situation would make the Army track down a 62-year-old retiree? What crisis would justify pulling ghosts out of their peaceful graves? You ever wonder, Bill continued, if maybe we don't get to stay retired? If maybe the country that made us what we are gets to call us back when things get desperate? Every veteran wonders that, Frank replied. Most of us just hope it never happens. Bill slid the business card back across the table. Lot of bad things happening in the world these days. Lot of good people in danger. If they're coming to you, it's because they think you might be able to help. Frank pocketed the card again, feeling its weight like a lead sinker, or because they're desperate and running out of options. Same thing, really, Bill said with a sad smile. Question is, can you live with saying no if people die because you stayed retired? Frank didn't have an answer for that. The truth was, he'd been asking himself the same question since Rodriguez walked away yesterday. He'd built his post-military life on the foundation of never having to make those kinds of decisions again. But apparently, the luxury of normal civilian problems was about to be taken away from him. As Frank drove home through the drizzling rain, he found himself taking a different route, one that passed by the small cemetery where Sarah was buried. He hadn't planned to stop, but his truck seemed to steer itself into the parking lot. Sarah's headstone was simple granite, just her name and dates and the words, beloved wife and mother. Frank stood in the rain for a long time, hands in his pockets, one finger unconsciously tracing the edge of Rodriguez's business card. "I don't know what to do, Sarah," he said to the stone. "I promised you I was done with all that. I promised you I'd be just Frank Mitchell, not Staff Sergeant Mitchell. But what if they really need me? What if saying no means people die?" Rain continued to fall and the stone offered no answers. Frank stood there until he was soaked through, hoping for some sign, some guidance from the woman who'd helped him find peace. But the only sound was rain on granite and the distant hum of traffic on the highway. When Frank finally got back to his truck, he was no closer to a decision than he'd been that morning. But as he started the engine, he realized that the very fact he was wrestling with the choice meant he'd already started down a path he wasn't sure he wanted to walk. Frank made it exactly 3 days before curiosity got the better of him. Saturday and Sunday passed in a blur of household chores and restless pacing. By Monday morning, Rodriguez's business card had taken on an almost magnetic quality, drawing Frank's attention every time he passed by the kitchen table where he'd finally placed it. The call came at 7:30 Monday evening, just as Frank was settling down with a frozen dinner and the evening news. The phone's shrill ring cut through a story about international tensions in Eastern Europe, and Frank knew before he answered who would be on the other end. "Mr. Mitchell, this is Colonel Rodriguez. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." Frank muted the television and leaned back in his recliner. "Colonel, I was wondering when you'd call. I gave you a few days to think things over. Have you had a chance to consider our conversation?" Frank looked at the business card, now creased from handling. "I've considered it. I'm still not interested in whatever you're selling." There was a pause on Rodriguez's end, the sound of papers rustling. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm going to be direct with you because I think you appreciate straight talk. We have a situation developing overseas. American hostages, including children. The hostage takers are holed up in a compound that's proven impossible to assault directly." Frank felt his stomach tighten. "There are plenty of active-duty snipers who can handle whatever needs handling, Colonel. Under normal circumstances, absolutely. But these aren't normal circumstances." Rodriguez's voice took on a more urgent tone. "The target location requires an extremely long-distance shot, over 1,500 meters, through variable wind conditions, with multiple obstacles. We've run computer simulations with our best current snipers. The success probability is less than 30%. Frank closed his eyes. 1,500 meters was a hell of a shot under ideal conditions. With wind and obstacles, it moved into the realm of nearly impossible. "What makes you think I could do better?" "Because you've done it before," Rodriguez said quietly. "Somalia, 1993. Operation Gothic Serpent. A shot at 1,600 meters that saved 32 Marines and ended a 3-day siege." The memory hit Frank like a physical blow. He remembered that shot, the impossible distance, the swirling dust, the weight of knowing that 32 American lives hung on his trigger finger. He'd made the shot, but it had cost him. The nightmares from that single moment had lasted for years. "That was a long time ago, Colonel. I was a different person then." "Muscle memory doesn't forget, Mr. Mitchell, and neither does experience. We've analyzed the ballistics from your service records. Your performance in extreme long-range scenarios was unprecedented. Frankly, we haven't seen anything like it before or since." Frank stood up and walked to his kitchen window, looking out at his quiet neighborhood. Mrs. Chen was walking her little dog. The Patterson kids were playing basketball in their driveway. Normal people living normal lives, oblivious to the fact that somewhere in the world other people were in cages waiting for someone to save them. "How many hostages?" Frank asked, hating himself for asking. 14 Americans, 8 adults, 6 children. They've been held for 11 days. Intelligence suggests the hostage takers plan to start executing prisoners in 72 hours if their demands aren't met. 6 children. Frank felt the old weight settling on his shoulders, the terrible burden of being the person who could make the difference between life and death. What are their demands? Release of prisoners, withdrawal of American forces from the region. Standard terrorist playbook. The location is a fortress compound in mountainous terrain. Traditional assault would result in heavy casualties, both military and civilian. Frank rubbed his temples, feeling a familiar headache building. And you think one old man with a rifle is the answer? I think one experienced sniper with your specific skill set might be able to take out the threat before they can harm the hostages. The shot would be from an adjacent mountain, clear field of fire, but the distance and conditions are extreme. I'm 62 years old, Colonel. My hands aren't as steady as they used to be, my eyes aren't as sharp. You're talking about a shot. That was difficult when I was in my prime. We've arranged for you to use the latest equipment. Computer-assisted targeting, weather monitoring, the best optics money can buy. And you'd have a full support team. Frank laughed. But there was no humor in it. Technology can't replace experience, but it can't replace youth either. What you're describing is a prayer shot, even for someone at the top of their game. Maybe, Rodriguez conceded. But it's the only shot these hostages have. We've exhausted diplomatic options. A direct assault is suicide for everyone involved. You're our best hope, possibly our only hope. Frank thought about the children. 6 kids who probably just wanted to go home, who were counting on adults to keep them safe. He thought about Sarah, about the promise he'd made to leave the war behind. He thought about Mrs. Chen walking her dog and the Patterson kids playing basketball, and how their peaceful world was protected by people willing to make impossible shots in impossible places. I need details, Frank heard himself saying. Terrain maps, weather data, intelligence on the hostage takers' positions. I need to know everything. Does that mean you'll consider it? Frank was quiet for a long moment, watching the Patterson kids sink basket after basket with the confidence of youth, unaware that sometimes the ball doesn't go where you aim it. It means I'll look at the situation, that's all I'm promising. That's all I can ask for. Can you meet me tomorrow? We have a secure facility about an hour from your location where we can go over everything in detail. What time? Whatever works for you, Mr. Mitchell. This is your show. Frank looked at his calendar, as if his retirement schedule of range time and grocery shopping might conflict with saving 14 lives. 10 o'clock. I'll text you the address. And Mr. Mitchell, thank you for listening. After Rodriguez hung up, Frank sat in his kitchen for an hour, staring at the business card and trying to convince himself he was just gathering information. But deep down, he knew that the moment he'd asked about the details, he'd already made his decision. The only question now was whether he could still make the shot that mattered. He spent the evening digging through his closet until he found the old army footlocker he hadn't opened in 15 years. Inside, wrapped in an oiled cloth, was his sniper's notebook. Hundreds of pages of wind calculations, range estimations, and shot records from his military career. The pages were yellowed with age, but the data was still good, still relevant. At the very back of the notebook was a photograph he'd forgotten about. His old team after a successful mission in the Gulf. 8 young soldiers grinning at the camera, full of confidence and brotherhood. Frank recognized his younger self in the middle, cocky and sure of his abilities. 3 of those 8 hadn't made it home. Frank closed the notebook and put it on the kitchen table next to Rodriguez's business card. Tomorrow he'd look at the intelligence, assess the situation, and make a professional evaluation. He told himself it was just a consultation, just an old soldier helping out with tactical analysis. But as he got ready for bed, Frank found himself doing stretching exercises he hadn't done in years, working out the kinks in his shoulders and back. His hands, when he held them steady, still showed barely a tremor. His eyes, when he focused on distant objects, could still pick out details that others missed. Maybe he was an old man living on memories, but maybe, just maybe, he was a weapon that still had one more shot in him. Tomorrow he'd find out which one was true. The last thing Frank did before turning off the lights was call his son David in California. It was late on the West Coast, but David answered on the second ring. Dad, everything okay? You don't usually call this late. Everything's fine, Frank lied. I just wanted to hear your voice. Tell the grandkids their grandpa loves them. Of course, Dad. Are you sure you're okay? You sound different. Frank looked at the notebook on his kitchen table, at Rodriguez's business card beside it, at the photograph of 8 young soldiers who'd believed they could change the world. I'm fine, son. Just wanted you to know I love you. All of you. After he hung up, Frank realized he might have just said goodbye. The secure facility turned out to be a nondescript office building 40 minutes outside the city, the kind of place that housed insurance companies and accounting firms. Frank parked between a Honda Civic and a minivan, wondering if the suburban camouflage was intentional or if the military had simply run out of dramatic locations for secret meetings. Rodriguez met him in the lobby, dressed in civilian clothes that didn't quite hide his military bearing. "Mr. Mitchell, thank you for coming. I know this isn't easy." Frank followed Rodriguez through a maze of ordinary-looking hallways until they reached an elevator that required a key card to operate. 3 floors down, the suburban office building facade gave way to the kind of high-tech facility Frank remembered from his classified briefings decades ago. The briefing room contained 6 people, all wearing the alert, focused expressions of intelligence professionals. Rodriguez made quick introductions: CIA analysts, military intelligence officers, a State Department liaison who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. Frank nodded politely, but his attention was drawn to the massive display screen showing satellite imagery of a mountainous region he didn't recognize. "This is the Coast Province in Afghanistan," Rodriguez began, using a laser pointer to highlight a compound built into a mountainside. "The hostages are being held here, in what used to be a monastery. The structure is ancient, but has been heavily fortified with modern defenses." Frank studied the imagery, his old tactical instincts automatically cataloging defensive positions, fields of fire, and potential approach routes. The compound was positioned like a fortress, with clear sight lines in all directions and natural barriers protecting most angles of attack. "The hostage takers?" Frank asked. 15 militants well-armed and trained. They've held this position for 3 weeks, fighting off 2 separate rescue attempts by Afghan forces. They know what they're doing. A CIA analyst named Morrison pulled up personnel files on the screen. "The leader is Hassan Nazir, former Afghan army officer who went rogue after the American withdrawal. He's using this situation to make a political statement." Frank examined the compound layout more carefully. The main building was carved directly into the mountainside, with only one visible entrance and windows positioned to provide maximum defensive advantage. "Where exactly are the hostages being held?" "Here," Rodriguez pointed to a section of the building that appeared to be a large central room. "Intelligence suggests they're all confined to this chamber, which has 2 guards, stationed outside at all times." "And you want me to take out the guards from where exactly?" The satellite image zoomed out, revealing a mountain ridge approximately 2 kilometers away. "There's a position on this opposite peak that provides a clear line of sight to the compound. Entrance. The distance is just over 1,600 meters with roughly 300 meters of elevation difference." Frank felt a familiar chill run down his spine. 1,600 meters wasn't just a long shot. It was at the absolute edge of what was humanly possible, even with perfect conditions. "What about wind patterns?" A meteorologist who'd been silent until now stepped forward. "That's the primary complication. The valley creates unpredictable wind currents, particularly in the afternoon. Morning hours show the most stable conditions, but even then we're looking at variable winds of 10 to 15 miles per hour." Frank did quick mental calculations, his brain automatically running ballistics tables he hadn't thought about in years. Variable winds at that distance could throw a shot off by several feet, easily the difference between a clean kill and a wounded guard who could alert the compound. "What's the timeline on this?" Frank asked. "The hostage takers have given us 68 hours to meet their demands," the State Department liaison said. "After that, they start executing prisoners, beginning with the children." Frank felt the familiar weight settling on his shoulders, the terrible burden of lives hanging in the balance. "Equipment?" Rodriguez activated another screen showing an array of high-tech weaponry. "Latest generation sniper rifle, computer-assisted targeting system, weather monitoring equipment. The best technology we have available." Frank studied the rifle specs with the eye of someone who'd spent decades perfecting his craft. The weapon was impressive, but technology could only do so much. At the end of the day, it still came down to human skill, judgment, and a little luck. "I need to see the position," Frank said. Satellite imagery is fine for planning, but I need to actually see the shot. We can have you there in 18 hours, Rodriguez replied. Military transport, full support team, whatever you need. Frank was quiet for several minutes, studying the tactical displays and running through scenarios in his mind. Every instinct, developed over 20 years of civilian life, was screaming at him to walk away, to let someone younger handle this impossible situation. But his military training, buried deep but never truly forgotten, was already calculating wind drift and bullet drop, already visualizing the shot. Success probability? Frank asked finally. The intelligence analyst looked uncomfortable. Based on computer modeling and current conditions, approximately 40%. That's assuming optimal weather and perfect execution. 40%. In Frank's experience, any shot with less than 60% probability was essentially a gamble. But 40% was better than the 0% chance the hostages had without someone trying. What happens if I miss? Frank asked. What happens if the shot fails? Rodriguez and the others exchanged glances. If you miss clean, the guards might not even realize they're under attack. You'd have time for a second shot, maybe a third. But if you wound one of them, they alert the compound, probably start killing hostages immediately, Frank finished. It was the nightmare scenario every sniper feared. The shot that made things worse instead of better. There is one other option, Morrison said reluctantly. We could try a simultaneous assault. Use your shot as cover for a ground team. Take out the guards, then storm the building while they're confused. Frank shook his head. Ground assault means casualties, both military and civilian. If you had a team capable of taking that compound without massive losses, you wouldn't need me. The room fell silent. Everyone knew Frank was right. They were here because conventional options had been exhausted, because the situation was desperate enough to warrant pulling a retired sniper back into service. Frank walked closer to the display screen, studying every detail of the compound's layout. Somewhere in that ancient building, 14 Americans were counting on people they'd never met to bring them home. 6 children who probably didn't understand why they were in cages, who just wanted their parents to make everything okay again. I'll need 3 days minimum to study the position and conditions, Frank said. I'll need complete weather data, wind patterns for the last 6 months, ballistics data for the rifle you want me to use. I'll need to actually fire the weapon, test my accuracy at comparable distances. Whatever you need, Rodriguez said immediately. And I'll need guarantee that if this goes wrong, if the shot fails, you'll have backup plans ready. I won't be responsible for getting those hostages killed, because someone put all their eggs in one basket. We'll have contingencies, Morrison assured him. Frank looked around the room at the faces of people who'd dedicated their careers to protecting American interests overseas. They were professionals, competent, experienced, but none of them could make the shot that needed making. That fell to a 62-year-old retiree who just wanted to shoot paper targets and tend his garden. All right, Frank said, feeling the weight of his old life settling back onto his shoulders like a familiar coat. Let's go save some hostages. The next few hours were a blur of paperwork, medical examinations, and equipment briefings. Frank signed forms he didn't read, submitted to tests he'd hoped never to take again, and tried to ignore the voice in his head that sounded suspiciously like Sarah asking him what the hell he thought he was doing. By late afternoon, Frank was back in his truck, driving home through familiar suburban streets that suddenly seemed like part of a different world. Tomorrow he'd be on a military transport heading for Afghanistan. In 3 days he'd either save 14 lives or live with their deaths on his conscience. That evening, Frank sat in his kitchen with his old sniper's notebook, running calculations, and reviewing fundamentals he'd hoped never to need again. Outside, the Patterson kids were still playing basketball, still sinking shots with the confidence of youth. Frank envied them their certainty, their belief that the ball always went where you aimed it. But some shots were too important to miss, even when the odds were against you. Especially when the odds were against you. Frank opened his notebook to a fresh page and began writing down everything he'd learned in the briefing. Somewhere in Afghanistan, 6 children were sleeping in a prison, trusting that morning would bring rescue instead of execution. Frank intended to make sure their trust wasn't misplaced. The military transport touched down at Bagram Air Base just before dawn, and Frank felt the familiar sensation of stepping back into a world he'd left behind. The air smelled of diesel fuel and dust, the same combination that had filled his lungs during his original tours decades ago. But everything else had changed. The base was smaller now, quieter, with the subdued atmosphere of an operation winding down rather than ramping up. Rodriguez met him on the tarmac with a full support team, a meteorologist, a ballistics expert, 2 security specialists, and a young Army Ranger named Thompson who would serve as Frank's spotter. The kid looked about 25, all sharp edges and nervous energy, trying hard to hide his excitement at working with a legendary sniper. "Mr. Mitchell," Thompson said, snapping to attention. "It's an honor, sir. I've studied your service record. That shot in Somalia is legendary among snipers." Frank shook the young soldier's hand, noting the calluses and steady grip of someone who'd spent serious time behind a rifle. "Call me Frank. And don't believe everything you read in reports. Half of those shots were luck disguised as skill. Sir, with respect, luck doesn't account for a 96% hit ratio in extreme long-range scenarios," Thompson replied earnestly. Frank studied the kid's eager face and remembered himself at that age, full of confidence and certainty that skill could overcome any obstacle. "We'll see what kind of luck we have in a few days, son." The helicopter ride to the forward operating base took 2 hours, flying low through mountain valleys that looked exactly like the terrain Frank remembered from his nightmares. Below them, ancient trade routes carved paths between peaks that had witnessed centuries of conflict. Frank pressed his face to the window, studying the landscape with tactical eyes that automatically cataloged firing positions and escape routes. The forward base was little more than a collection of temporary structures and communication equipment, positioned in a valley about 5 kilometers from the target compound. Rodriguez had assembled everything Frank had requested: weather monitoring equipment, a rifle range for testing, and detailed topographical maps of the entire region. But it was the rifle itself that commanded Frank's attention. The weapon was a work of art, precision engineered to deliver accuracy at distances that would have been impossible with the equipment he'd used during his active duty years. Computer-assisted targeting, advanced optics, barrel harmonics calibrated to match specific ammunition loads. It was the kind of rifle Frank could only have dreamed about 20 years ago. "Let's see what this thing can do," Frank said, settling behind the weapon at the makeshift range. The familiar weight of a rifle stock against his shoulder brought back muscle memories he'd tried to forget, the unconscious adjustments and breathing patterns that had once been as natural as walking. Thompson sat up beside him with spotting equipment, ready to call out corrections and wind readings. "Range is 800 meters to start, sir. Wind steady at 5 miles per hour from the northwest." Frank settled into his shooting position, feeling his body remember skills that transcended conscious thought. The scope brought the distant target into sharp focus, revealing details invisible to the naked eye. His breathing slowed automatically, his heartbeat settling into the rhythm he'd learned to control decades ago. The first shot was high and slightly left, adjusting for wind conditions that weren't quite what the instruments indicated. The second shot was closer, still not perfect. By the 5th shot, Frank was putting rounds through the same hole at 800 meters, the rifle and shooter working together like old dance partners remembering their steps. "Outstanding shooting, sir," Thompson said, genuine admiration in his voice. At this rate, the 1,600-meter shot should be manageable. Frank wasn't so sure. 800 meters with steady winds was vastly different from 1,600 meters with variable mountain conditions. But the rifle felt good in his hands, responsive and accurate. If the shot was possible at all, this weapon gave him the best chance of making it. They spent the rest of the day studying the actual target position, using high-powered telescopes to examine the compound from their intended shooting location. The ancient monastery seemed to grow directly from the mountainside, its stone walls weathered by centuries of wind and snow. Frank could see the guards stationed outside the main entrance, tiny figures at this distance but clear enough to identify as human targets. 1,620 meters, Thompson confirmed, reading the distance from their laser rangefinder. Elevation difference of 280 meters, target slightly downhill. Frank studied the compound through his scope, noting the guards' routine, their positioning, the way they moved and interacted. Professional observation revealed that these weren't random terrorists. They moved with military precision, maintained proper fields of fire, and rotated positions on a disciplined schedule. They know what they're doing, Frank observed. Former military, probably special forces trained. This isn't going to be easy, even if everything goes perfectly. The meteorologist set up his equipment and began taking detailed wind readings, creating a profile of the air currents that would affect a bullet's flight path. The valley creates a funnel effect, he explained. Wind speeds can vary significantly between here and the target, sometimes changing direction completely. Frank spent the evening reviewing intelligence reports and studying photographs of the hostages. 14 faces stared back at him from personnel files, diplomats, aid workers, journalists, and their families who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The children were the hardest to look at. 3 boys and 3 girls between the ages of 8 and 14. Their school photos showing the kind of innocent confidence that Frank's generation had grown up with before the world became so dangerous. That night, lying in his sleeping bag in a tent that smelled of canvas and diesel fumes, Frank found himself thinking about Sarah. She'd never asked about the details of his missions, never pressed him for stories about the shots he'd made or the lives he'd taken. But she'd understood the weight he carried, the nights when he'd wake up in a cold sweat, reliving moments when a fraction of an inch had meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "What would you tell me to do?" he whispered to the darkness, knowing Sarah wasn't there to answer but needing to ask anyway. The response came not in words, but in memory. Sarah's voice from years ago, after he'd struggled with a particularly difficult decision about whether to take a job that required travel away from the family. "You always know what's right, Frank," she'd said. "You just sometimes need permission to do it." Thompson appeared at Frank's tent flap just before dawn, carrying coffee and the latest weather reports. "Morning, Frank. Conditions look good for today. Clear skies, wind steady between 10 and 12 miles per hour." Frank accepted the coffee gratefully, noting that the young soldier had dropped the formal sir and was treating him more like a peer than a legend. It was a good sign. Familiarity would be important when they were working together under pressure. "Let's go take another look at the shot," Frank said, gathering his equipment. They hiked to the shooting position as the sun came up, painting the mountains in shades of gold and red that reminded Frank why people had been fighting over this terrain for thousands of years. It was beautiful country, harsh and unforgiving but undeniably magnificent. Frank settled behind his rifle and studied the compound through his scope. The guards were already at their posts, following the same routine they'd maintained for days. Professional, disciplined, but also predictable. That predictability might be the edge Frank needed. "Range confirmed at 1620, Thompson called out softly. "Wind steady at 11 miles per hour, direction northwest. Temperature 72 degrees, barometric pressure steady." Frank made minute adjustments to his scope settings, calculating bullet drop and wind drift with formulas he'd memorized decades ago. The mathematics of long-range shooting were unforgiving. A single miscalculation could send his bullet several feet off target at this distance. "Tell me about the hostages," Frank said, keeping his eye on the scope while Thompson consulted. His intelligence briefing. Diplomatic mission that was captured during a routine inspection of aid distribution sites. The adults include Ambassador Patricia Williams, her husband and 2 children, a State Department security officer, 3 aid workers from different organizations, and a journalist documenting the aid program. Frank thought about those children, probably scared and confused, wondering why adults couldn't protect them from this nightmare. The weight of their lives settled on his shoulders like a familiar burden. The terrible responsibility of being the person who might be able to bring them home. "Wind's picking up," Thompson observed, checking his instruments. 13 miles per hour now, shifting slightly more to the west. Frank made the corresponding adjustments, feeling the old familiar tension building in his chest. Every variable had to be perfect. Wind, temperature, humidity, even the rotation of the earth became factors at this distance. One mistake, one moment of uncertainty, and 14 people would pay the price. But as Frank settled into his final shooting position, feeling the rifle become an extension of his body, he realized that some things never really left you. The skills might rust from disuse, the eyes might not be as sharp as they once were, but the core ability, the capacity to make the impossible shot when lives depended on it, was still there, waiting for the moment when it would be needed most. Tomorrow morning, Frank would find out if 22 years of civilian life had dulled his edge, or if some weapons just got better with age. Frank woke at 4 a.m. without an alarm, his body responding to decades-old patterns of preparation. The execution was scheduled for sunrise. Intelligence indicated the hostage-takers planned to begin killing prisoners at first light, starting with the youngest children to maximize psychological impact. He dressed methodically, checking each piece of equipment with the ritual precision of someone who understood that forgotten details could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. The rifle was cleaned and calibrated. Ammunition was inspected round by round. Weather instruments were tested and recalibrated. Thompson appeared with coffee and the final weather briefing. "Conditions are as good as we're going to get," the young soldier reported. "Wind steady at 9 miles per hour, clear visibility, temperature holding steady. If we're going to do this, now's the time." Frank accepted the coffee but barely tasted it. His mind was already shifting into the zone he'd inhabited during his most critical shots, a state of hyper-awareness where everything except the target and the trigger seemed to fade into background noise. The hike to the shooting position took 20 minutes following a path they'd rehearsed multiple times over the past 2 days. Frank moved with deliberate care, conserving energy and maintaining the steady breathing that would be crucial when the moment came. Rodriguez was waiting at the position with the rest of the support team. "Intelligence confirms the hostages are still alive," he reported quietly. "The guards are maintaining their normal routine. Everything is go from our end." Frank nodded, settling behind his rifle and beginning the final preparations. The compound appeared peaceful in the early morning light, almost serene except for the armed guards visible at the entrance. Somewhere inside that ancient building, 14 Americans were starting what they hoped wouldn't be their last day. "Range 1,620 meters confirmed," Thompson called out softly, settling beside Frank with the spotting equipment. "Wind steady at 8 to 9 miles per hour northwest. Barometric pressure stable." Frank peered through his scope, bringing the distant compound into sharp focus. The 2 guards were in position exactly as intelligence had predicted, following the same routine they'd maintained for days. They looked relaxed, confident in their fortress-like position and probably not expecting trouble from the distant mountains. Through his earpiece, Frank could hear radio chatter from the support teams positioned around the valley. Helicopter, extraction unit standing by, medical teams ready to treat the hostages, diplomatic personnel prepared to coordinate the aftermath. Dozens of people whose success or failure depended on Frank's ability to make 2 precise shots at an almost impossible distance. "Wind shift," Thompson reported. 9 miles per hour now, direction steady northwest. Frank made a minute adjustment to his scope, recalculating the bullet's trajectory based on the changing conditions. At this distance, a single mile per hour of wind difference could throw his shot off by several inches. The margin for error was essentially 0. Through the scope, Frank watched the guards begin their morning routine. One lit a cigarette while the other checked his weapon, casual movements that spoke of men who'd grown comfortable in their superiority. They had no idea that 1,600 meters away, their lives were being measured in heartbeats. "Radio intercept indicates they're preparing to bring out the first hostage," Rodriguez reported through Frank's earpiece. "We estimate you have less than 10 minutes before they start the executions." Frank felt his breathing settle into the pattern he'd learned decades ago, each inhale and exhale precisely controlled to minimize movement. His heartbeat slowed, becoming a steady rhythm that he could time his shots between. The rifle felt like an extension of his body, perfectly balanced and responsive to every micro-adjustment. "First guard is in position," Thompson called out. "Clean shot, no obstructions." Frank centered his crosshairs on the first guard's chest, accounting for wind drift and bullet drop across the enormous distance. The man was completely unaware that death was looking at him through a telescopic sight, casually smoking his cigarette while children waited in terror just meters away. The mathematics were perfect. The conditions were as good as they would get. Everything depended on Frank's ability to trust in skills he'd hoped never to use again. "On your command," Thompson whispered. Frank's finger found the trigger, applying just enough pressure to take up the slack without firing. One smooth pull would send a precision bullet across more than a mile of mountain air, carrying with it the hopes of 14 innocent people and the weight of Frank's past and future. He thought briefly of Sarah, of the promise he'd made to leave the killing behind. But some promises had to be broken to keep others. Some skills were too important to let rust away completely. "Wind holding steady," Thompson reported. "Target stationary. Clear shot." Frank exhaled slowly, letting his breathing settle into the natural pause between breaths where his body would be perfectly still. In that moment of absolute stillness, when his crosshairs were perfectly aligned and every variable was accounted for, Frank squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder with familiar authority, sending its deadly message across the valley. Frank immediately cycled the bolt and shifted to the second target, not waiting to see the result of his first shot. At this distance, the bullet would take nearly 2 seconds to reach its target. "First target down," Thompson called out calmly. "Clean hit center mass. Second target turning looks confused." The second guard was already moving, alerted by his partner's sudden collapse but not yet understanding the nature of the threat. Frank tracked him through the scope, leading the target slightly to account for movement, calculating the split-second timing that would put his bullet exactly where it needed to be. "Second shot. Clear target," Frank said quietly, more to himself than to Thompson. Another controlled breath. Another moment of perfect stillness, another smooth trigger pull. This time Frank watched through his scope as the bullet found its mark, the second guard dropping instantly to join his partner. 1,600 meters away, 2 men who'd threatened innocent lives were eliminated with surgical precision, clearing the way for the rescue teams waiting in the valley below. "Both targets down," Thompson confirmed, excitement creeping into his professional calm. "Outstanding shooting, Frank. Both kills confirmed." Through his earpiece, Frank could hear Rodriguez coordinating the rescue operation. Helicopters were already in the air, carrying assault teams to the now unguarded compound. The children who'd gone to sleep expecting execution would instead wake up to freedom. Frank remained in position, watching through his scope as the rescue unfolded. Within minutes, American soldiers were breaching the compound entrance, moving with practiced efficiency through rooms that no longer held any defenders. The operation Frank had made possible was proceeding exactly as planned. "Hostages secured," came the report over the radio. "All 14 confirmed alive and responsive. Medical teams are evaluating, but initial assessment is good. Outstanding work, everyone." Frank finally lifted his head from the scope, feeling the familiar mixture of satisfaction and emptiness that followed successful missions. The immediate crisis was over. Lives had been saved. But the weight of what he'd done would stay with him. It always did. Thompson was grinning from ear to ear, the young soldier's excitement infectious despite Frank's more measured response. "That was incredible, Frank. 2 shots at over 1,600 meters, both perfect. I've never seen anything like it." Frank began breaking down his rifle with methodical precision, muscle memory guiding his hands through the familiar routine. "It was a good day for it," he said simply. "Wind was steady, visibility was clear. Sometimes everything just lines up right." But Frank knew it was more than luck. The shots he'd just made required skills that couldn't be taught in any school, experience that couldn't be downloaded from any manual. They required the kind of expertise that only came from years of making life-and-death decisions through a telescopic sight. The helicopter ride back to the base was subdued, each team member processing the successful mission in their own way. Frank stared out the window at the mountains below, thinking about the children who would see their families again, about the parents who wouldn't have to bury their kids. Rodriguez found him later that evening as Frank was preparing for the flight home. "The State Department wants to debrief you, probably offer you some kind of recognition. The president himself has been briefed on the operation." Frank shook his head. "I don't need recognition, Colonel. I just want to go home." "What you did today saved 14 lives, Frank. That shot will be studied and talked about for years to come. Frank fired his first shot of the day, watching it punch through the center of the target with satisfying precision. He was home now, back to his peaceful routine. But he knew that if the phone rang again, if children were in danger, and impossible, shots needed making, he'd be ready. After all, he was still Staff Sergeant Mitchell when it mattered. He just learned to hide it better.